Hello and welcome to the Two Fat Lardies Oddcast. No music today. We are very aware that today is Remembrance Sunday here in the United Kingdom and in Commonwealth countries all around the globe. And we're also very aware that due to the unfortunate circumstances of lockdowns and general issues with COVID-19, that many people are unable to go to a Remembrance Sunday events that they would normally go, as it is today when we traditionally remember and even celebrate the lives of those who gave their all for their country and for us and our generation so that we can enjoy the liberties and democracy that we so often take for granted. So today, Nick and Sid and I ask ourselves, who do we remember when we think of Remembrance Sunday? Now, every family has their own memories and their own reasons for those memories. But for us, this is an insight into who we think about on Remembrance Sunday.
My remembrance story is about my great uncle, Albert Skinner, and his role in the First World War. Albert Skinner was the oldest of 6 children who lived near the village of Great Chart near Ashford in Kent. He was born in 1897. When war broke out in 1914, he joined up to join the Buffs and went through his basic training. In April 1915, the Kent regiments were reorganised and Albert was transferred into what was the Kent Composite Battalion, and then into the 2nd of the 4th Royal West Kents, where he was a Lance Corporal. And on the 20th of July 1915, after 2 months of training at Cambridge and at Bedford, the 2nd of the 4th Royal West Kents moved to Devon, and on the 20th of July, they embarked on board the SS Northland, the only clue to their destination being the issue of tropical kit. So they sailed to the southwest through the Bay of Biscay, past the Straits of Gibraltar, and after a short stop at Alexandria, the ships headed north to the small island of Lemnos, which was the mustering area for troops going to Gallipoli. On the 10th of August, they made the short journey across to Suvla Bay and landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula, the idea being that the Suvla Bay attack would remove pressure on the landings that had happened earlier in the year in April and which were making poor progress up through the peninsula. The landings were a success, but were not pushed with any aggressive intent really by the British commanders, who dug in and failed to make any real headway. I think a week after they landed, the battalion attacked Turkish positions in an attack which advanced the front some 200 yards. But the British commanders squandered their opportunities, and by September, any chance of breakthrough had gone. In October, the weather deteriorated rapidly. Heavy storms swept the peninsula, and fighting became secondary to simple survival. The battalion, it says in their history, suffered great hardship, and in the horrific conditions, many men succumbed to disease. In their dugouts, Albert and his mates did the best they could. Parcels from home containing treats were very much prized. By November, it was clear that the campaign on Gallipoli was a disaster and the troops should be evacuated. And Albert and the rest of the Royal West Kents were finally evacuated on the 10th of December, but they weren't evacuated home. They were, in fact, the 200 of them who had remained of the initial 800 were transferred to Egypt. 1916 was a time of reorganisation for the High Command, and while they planned their moves, the West Kent boys struggled in the heat, spending a little bit of time in the Western Desert. But by midsummer 1916, General Murray was ready to make his next move with an attack on Turkish held Palestine. The Turks had attempted to cross the Suez Canal earlier in the war, but since then had been fairly quiet in that region. The advance across Sinai was slow. However, somehow amidst all the dust and road building that went on as they crossed the Sinai Desert, Albert actually managed to get his photograph taken, and the two photos of him taken at that time have found their way into the family records. And he also at that time received a promotion to corporal, which he said was a little bit more work and a little bit more money. By March 1917, the British Army was ready to make an attack into Palestine proper towards Gaza and hoped that a bold push could produce a famous victory. The first attempt to seize Gaza didn't go very well, and Albert and the Royal West Kents spent most of the day wandering around in the fog. The Turks spent the next month strengthening their defences, and on the 19th of April, the Second Battle of Gaza took place, and the objective for the Royal West Kents was a feature known as Samson Ridge to the southwest of the town, now swallowed up in the urban growth. Tanks newly arrived from the Western Front were used in Palestine for the first time. Most of them broke down in the intense heat, and those that didn't made good targets for the Turkish artillery. The Royal West Kents took the ridge after a bloody struggle, and fighting continued the next day, and Albert was wounded. He took a bullet in the left side of his neck, which came out through his back just below his shoulder, and he was taken to hospital in Cairo, where he slept in a bed for the first time since he'd left England. It seemed so strange to be in a good bed after being so long lying on the sand for about 2 years, he said. Whilst in Cairo, he also got a chance to see the pyramids and the Sphinx and the other sites out there, but he didn't get to go back to England. After the two setbacks at Gaza, the British changed their commander and replaced Murray with General Allenby. Allenby was a commander from the Western Front, known to his men as the Bull, and came with a clear offensive brief and additional men to make a further attack. He needed every man he could, and so Albert rejoined the regiment in October. On the 24th of October 1917, the battalion was reinforced and sent up into the front line. Rumours spread that an attack was imminent. "I have rejoined my regiment," wrote Albert, "and we shall soon be with Johnny Turk again." On the 27th of October, the order came to advance, and the third British attempt to break the Gaza-Beersheba line was about to begin. It was Albert Skinner's 30th birthday. Initially, the Turks withdrew, and Beersheba fell to the Australians after a famous cavalry charge across open ground. But once they reached the hills north of the town, the Turks stopped running and prepared a second defensive line at Al-Khalifa. On the evening of the 2nd of November 1917, the men of B Company moved into position for the attack they were going to make the next day on an objective known only as Hill 1250, which was a bracken-covered hill held in some strength by the Turks. The attack began at daylight, and heavy fire from Turkish machine guns cut down many. But by 6 p.m, despite the difficulties, the line had been pushed forward. The Royal West Kents lost 40 men, but the Turks still held some positions, and the battalion would need to attack again the next day. At dawn on the 4th of November, the Royal West Kents prepared themselves for the attack. Mess tins were cleaned and kit was inspected. At 05:10 hours, what little artillery the Commonwealth troops had been able to pull forward over the hard terrain opened fire, and the bombardment was short, lasting just 10 minutes. When the guns fell silent, the men of B Company moved in to begin their attack. The Turks unleashed a murderous fire. One of the companies managed to reach their objective, but only momentarily. Turkish fire prevented the other companies from making any progress. Machine guns spat fire across dusty ground, and Albert Skinner fell. By 8:25 a.m, the survivors had been forced into a gully at the foot of the hill, and no further ground could be made. Machine gun fire prevented stretcher bearers from reaching the wounded. Water ran short. Dying men suffered in the heat. The attack broke down. The Royal West Kents were pinned. Other attempts were made over the next 2 days to force the Turkish position, but each attempt failed. But elsewhere the Turks were beaten, and about 5 p.m. on the 7th of November, I think, the Turks withdrew. The Commonwealth troops were able to move up. This gave them a chance to collect the dead and the wounded. Albert Skinner was buried where he fell, in a small gully at the foot of the ridge, and a photo of this temporary grave has found its way back into the family. And that was the end of Albert Skinner's war. His body was moved to the Commonwealth War Graves Cemetery at Beersheba, where it's looked after to this day. Back in Kent, his family received the news that he died, and when the famous dead men's pennies were issued to families of fallen soldiers, my great-grandfather said that he wouldn't have the bloody thing in the house because it wasn't a fair swap. Just one more thing to end on. It's ironic, I think, and perhaps touching, that in December 1917, by the time the Royal West Kents had pushed through Palestine and Jerusalem had fallen, that the night of 24th of December 1917, the Royal West Kent Regiment were bivouacked in a small village called Bethlehem.
I never knew my grandfather, but what I did know is that he had served in the British Army during the First World War and been wounded on the first day of the Somme. I say I knew this because that's what my dad told me, and why would he not know? But he didn't know. When my grandmother died and we cleared her house out, we found a notebook that had belonged to my grandfather, and in it was quite a lot of scribblings, and I've got it here. It's Army Book 136. It just seems to be a small notebook, and what purpose it serves I'm not sure, apart from the fact that on the front page he has written in A Company, B Depot, Royal Engineers Signals at Bedford, and then underneath that he has got an address of a camp in Wales where he was clearly based, and then another camp on Anglesey at Beaumaris at the Kingsbridge Camp, number 2 hut, Kingsbridge Camp, Anglesey in North Wales. So clearly stating where he was at certain times, albeit with no information in there to tell us what he was doing there or what it was about. Well, some of the things that were in there I was able to go through and work out that he had never been at the Battle of the Somme, but he had been wounded, and that was actually on the first day of another big battle, the Battle of Passchendaele, the Battle of Third Ypres, which took place on the Western Front from July to November 1917, really for control of the ridges to the south and east of the Belgian city of Ypres in West Flanders. Strategically, the village of Passchendaele is on the last ridge to the east of Ypres, so securing it would severely limit German observation of the salient which was defending that town. And more importantly, so the big plan went, allow British attacks, including an amphibious assault on the Belgian coast between Newport and Ostend, which would then open the route to Bruges and onto Antwerp and onto victory, I presume. Interesting idea of a World War I D-Day possibly happening in 1917. Anyway, one of the initial phases of battle was to be the attack on the Gevelt Plateau, and two corps, which he formed part of, had the most difficult task, which was attacking the Pilkem Ridge against the main German defensive positions. But I'm getting ahead of myself, actually. One of the things I found out was that William Clark, which was my grandfather's name, volunteered for the British Army on the 11th of December 1915 as part of Lord Derby's scheme, which put him in the Army Reserve B. Part of the reason for Lord Derby's scheme was British government to see if they could raise enough manpower purely by volunteers, or whether they needed to introduce conscription. And it was a scheme which allowed men to wear an armband saying, look, I've volunteered, because white feathers were flying around at that point in time. And I know from a newspaper cutting from the period that my grandfather was actually involved in ammunition work at the time, and consequently in a reserved occupation. And probably because of that, and because of the fact that he wasn't a young man, he wasn't actually called up and signed up permanently until the 29th of March 1917, joining the Royal Engineers and training at what he called Fort Darling in Chatham. It's not actually called that, it's got another name, but the name escapes me, but it's very similar to that. Anyway, he went out to France on the 9th of June 1917. And he was immediately transferred to the Northamptonshire Regiment, the 7th Battalion, which is what it says on his medals. And I had always assumed that he fought with Edgar Mobb's battalion. Edgar Mobbs was a famous England rugby player who raised a sportsman's battalion, or raised a sportsman's company, which later expanded into a battalion, and went into action on the first day of Battle of Ypres. Well, it's on his medals. That was the date that it said in the notebook. But no, further looking through this notebook in preparation for this show, I note that he transfers to the 12th Battalion of Royal Fusiliers, where, he said, I had to be very smart when walking out. Slightly amusing comment attached to that. I didn't much care for France and Belgium and the very low moral class of the people. I have seen things committed on the public highway for which people would get 6 months in England, which possibly is demonstrative of rather Victorian values, which wouldn't be surprising, as my grandfather was actually born in 1880. So that by the time he went out in June 1917, he was 37 years old, not a young man at all. Anyway, the big battle, as he refers to it in his diary, was being prepared for. The German army knew that the British were coming, and on the 27th of June they issued their orders for a defensive battle. By late 1917, trench warfare had moved on from the continuous lines of the early years to a more flexible defensive arrangement with pillboxes and interlocking fields of fire covering heavily strewn ground covered in wire. The German defences here had a forward zone, a main battle zone, a rear battle zone. The front system had got 3 defensive lines about 200 yards apart, and about 2,000 yards behind these works was the Albrechtstellung, the Albert position, which marked the rear boundary of the forward zone. Now, in front of that, there was a network of sharpshooter machine gun nests and infantry bunkers where troops could shelter ready to support those. Now, 2,000 yards behind that was the Wilhelmstellung, where the Germans had their main artillery positions, more bunkers. They had the Eingreiftruppen there, the counter-attack Truppen, ready to attack where the British gained any ground. Well, the attack was due to begin on the 31st of July, and my granddad notes that they were resting in the Micmac camp, which is a big British Army transit camp. At tea time on Sunday night, a fellow shot his finger off rather than go up the line. And the next day we moved off into the trenches, where we stayed all day beside a heavy battery which kept up a continuous roar. Fritz came over in an aeroplane and turned his machine guns on us, causing 1 or 2 casualties. Anyway, he goes on. We moved off to as near as we could get to the front line, Fritz's lines, under shelling all night. I was nearly killed several times, being covered in mud. We dug ourselves in, and I went out and got a bit of zinc for covering the trench. Well, by zinc he means corrugated iron. Here we sat all night with the shells falling around us, and were glad when we had the order to move off, and we did so at 3 in the morning. The barrage started at 10 to 4, which sounded like 1,000 aeroplanes dropping their bombs all at once. Off we went and received the orders to fix bayonets. Now we were in the thick of it, killing and fighting with bayonets. It was terrible. Dead lay everywhere. I was taking cover with 3 others when bash, I was shot in the foot. The pain was terrible and I didn't like to look at the wound. The round had gone through my foot and the top of my boot was cut clean away. I was lying in terrible agony and bleeding very fast. I applied my field dressing but couldn't stop the flow of blood. This was at 6 o'clock on Tuesday morning. Lying around and nearby were men who'd been killed. I kept coming over very weak but crawled to a dugout where I stayed all night. I fainted away several times during the night but no one came to help. Only the wounded and dying were around me. Fritz shelled the dugout all night, which I thought would collapse at any minute. But I got 2 biscuit tins and a box lid and I lay down on that for a time. I must have slipped off, as when I woke I found myself lying in 6 inches of water. Soon after I woke, some German prisoners arrived and brought me back to our own lines, but I didn't reach the first field dressing station until 11 o'clock on Wednesday after laying out for 30 hours. The loss of blood was terrible, and after the wound was dressed I was moved to a second dressing station where my wound was dressed again. It was raining in torrents and I was covered in mud with my wounded foot in a sandbag. I had no puttees or gas mask and I was put on a trolley on the light railway, but a heavy shell came over and blew 50 yards of the line away and the trolley ran off the rails several times. The cries of the wounded was terrible. Men were wading through mud as they loaded up another trolley, which by providence was coming up. They put us on that and we were glad when we could see the motors in sight. We were loaded up and we were driven down to the clearing station where we had tea, that being the first piece of bread I'd had since Monday. After that, we were off again on the hospital out by Popperinge. Several men had died by the time we arrived. They had no fresh clothes for us, so after being soaked in the rain for several days, we just stripped off and got into bed. My foot was in terrible pain and I was very weak, but was loaded up in the hospital train on Thursday night. We headed to Boulogne. To our surprise, there were German prisoners with lovely clean blankets, socks and shirts, whereas we poor English with our wet clothes on had to lay on the floor shaking from head to foot. I was weak as a cat, but it made us mad. If I had the strength, I should have had some of those clean clothes from those Germans. Never did I dream that they could have treated us so cruelly, but seeing is believing. And he goes on to say about how his arms and legs were now covered with big blisters from the effects of mustard gas, which must have seeped down into the bunker where he was taking cover. Anyway, by the 4th of August, he'd landed in the UK and was at Lord Derby's hospital in Warrington, so where his military career began with Lord Derby signing up. His career ended with Lord Derby at his hospital in Warrington, where William states, "I'm having a good time, and it seems like being in heaven after the pains and tortures of war." Well, he'd actually been hit in the ankle, which is a classic wound from a machine gun bullet firing grazing fire across the battlefield. And he was actually to remain in hospital until the middle of 1919 when he was demobbed, where he'd obviously suffered in terms of having to have some parts of his foot rebuilt or bones broken. My father recalls that he applied for some kind of military pension, which amused my dad because my grandfather obviously survived the war and went on to be a very active builder, which is not work that you would want to be undertaking if you were actually had a foot disability. But he lived and was very much looking forward to meeting me. My mother was expecting, but 5 days before I was born, he died at age 83 in June 1963. So in a way, it would have seemed very strange to have been physically connected to a man who was born in 1880, which seems like something out of a Sherlock Holmes story. But in another way, it's a very sad story that when my mother had given birth to me, my father had to leave and go down to the Cambridgeshire Fens, where his family came from, to bury his father. So I spent my childhood going to my grandmother's house, who didn't die until I was 17 years old. And the house was very much a time capsule and full of books on the Great War, which my grandfather clearly felt had been a major part of his life. And not surprising, really, he was one of 8 boys who had 8 sons who'd signed up to serve in the Great War, and all of them survived, with the sad exception of his brother Herbert, who died of dysentery in the Gaza Strip in Palestine in December 1918, having survived the entire war but succumbed to dysentery at that point. He is commemorated on the War Memorial at Isleham Village Church in Cambridgeshire, and clearly on any Remembrance Sunday he is someone who I think of. So whilst when I think of Remembrance Sunday I don't necessarily think solely of that Great War, but for my family it's clearly a war to which we have a very great connection. It's the First World War, I think, that to my mind was what Remembrance Sundays were all about, because of that grandfather who I never met.
I'd like to remember my Uncle Sam, Frederick J. Sanborn, Royal Navy, leading signalman, 235519. Uncle Sam was quite a character. He lived about 30 miles from where I grew up as a child, and I do remember him very vividly, mainly because Uncle Sam had a lovely cat called Tiger. And Tiger was a beautiful tabby cat which was extraordinarily friendly. And when I was 6 or 7, I used to go up to see Uncle Sam, taken up by my mum, and me and my sister would go and spend a day with him and his wife playing in his garden. I got loads of photos from that time, which unfortunately at the moment are at my mum's house. I can't get to them, but which just show me and my sister playing in the garden, messing around with Tiger, playing with a bubble hoop, producing huge sort of bubbles in the air, as kids do. Uncle Sam was always fond of telling a story. Some of the stories we obviously just thought were ridiculous. He used to pretend, or at least we thought, that he'd met certain admirals, that he'd been in huge battles, that he'd been shipwrecked all around the world, and we just assumed this was just one of Uncle Sam's many tall stories. Now, my mum had been evacuated up to Bridlington, the town where Uncle Sam lived on the northeast coast of England, during the Second World War, to get away from the bombing in our hometown of Hull. And Uncle Sam worked at the Coast Guard station just north of Bridlington. And I always thought that his stories were about the Second World War, and they sounded pretty implausible. And it was only later, when I was a teenager, I was doing a school project, I think in the 6th form, about relatives in the First World War as part of my A-level history course, that I found out that Uncle Sam hadn't just been in the Second World War, he'd also been in the First World War, and that quite a lot of the stories were actually true. Frederick John Sanborn was one of 6 children. He was born on the 22nd of August 1890 and enlisted into the Royal Navy at Devonport in Plymouth on the 19th of January 1906. And when war broke out in 1914, he was a leading signalman on board HMS Warrior. HMS Warrior was a Warrior-class armoured cruiser built for the Royal Navy in the first decade of the 20th century, and when war broke out she was stationed in the Mediterranean and participated in the pursuit of the German battlecruiser Goeben and the light cruiser Breslau. She was transferred to the Grand Fleet in December 1914 and remained there for the rest of her career. She was heavily damaged at the Battle of Jutland, after which she withdrew and was later abandoned and sank in a rising sea. Warrior was part of the 1st Cruiser Squadron, and at the Battle of Jutland, 31st of May 1916, this was scouting in front of the Grand Fleet. And at 5:47 p.m, in the gloom of a foggy afternoon, the squadron flagship HMS Defiance and Warrior spotted the German 2nd Scouting Group and opened fire. The shells fell short and the 2 ships turned to port in pursuit, cutting in front of the battlecruiser Lion, which was forced to turn away to avoid a collision. And shortly afterwards, Warrior spotted the disabled German light cruiser Wiesbaden and closed to engage. When the 2 ships reached a short range of only 5,500 yards, they were spotted in turn by the German battlecruiser Der Flinger, and 4 battleships were less than 8,000 yards away. The fire from the German ships was heavy, and HMS Defence blew up at 6:20 p.m. Warrior was hit by at least 15 28cm and 6 15cm shells, but was saved when the German ships switched their fire to the battleship HMS Warspite when its steering jammed and caused Warspite to make 2 complete circles within sight of much of the High Seas Fleet. But Warrior was heavily damaged by the German shells, which caused large fires on board and heavy flooding. And as a result of that, she withdrew to the west. She was finally taken in tow by one of the other ships, who took off her surviving crew of 743, one of which was my Uncle Sam. And the Warrior was abandoned in a rising sea when her upper deck was only 4 feet above the water. Warrior foundered and sank. Now, strangely, Uncle Sam had always said he'd been shipwrecked, and we thought that that was a strange expression, because we would assume if he was on a naval ship, he would have said that he was sunk. But to a naval man like Uncle Sam, shipwrecked and foundering was exactly the right term to use for a ship which is heavily damaged by the enemy, but then abandoned and left to fall under the waves. And Sam also mentioned that sometimes the Admiral would speak to him, and as a signalman, it seems that Rear Admiral Sir Robert Kenneth Keith Arbuthnot, who used as part of the 1st Cruiser Squadron Warrior as his flagship, may well have spoken to Uncle Sam when he asked Uncle Sam to send messages from Uncle Sam's signal station. So it turned out that Uncle Sam's stories, which so entranced me as a boy, turned out to be true. He was at the Battle of Jutland. His ship was heavily damaged by German shells, and if only now I could talk to him about his memories of his comrades and of what he experienced, that would be just wonderful. But I do at least have the amazing memories of going to his house and playing with his cat Tiger when I was a really small boy. And who knows, I think it's quite possible that Tiger was named after one of the other battle cruisers in the Grand Fleet in the Great War. So when I remember at this time of year Uncle Sam, Frederick John Sanborn, who died in his sleep at the age of 91 in Bridlington, will be one of the people that I always remember.
So there you are, 3 stories from 3 families, and a reminder, I think, that remembrance for all of us is a personal thing. Our minds go to our own stories from our own families. We've shared ours with you, and we'd like you to share yours with us. If you have a story or a photo that you particularly are drawn to at Remembrance, then we'd like to hear it and see it. So please, if you follow us on Twitter, feel free to share your stories and photos with us and others in our gaming community. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.